Hello everyone and welcome back. A big thank you to everybody who has subscribed. If you have not subscribed, please do so that you will get a notification each time I upload a new video. In today's video, we are going to look at the political life of Kenya's founding father, Jomo Kenyatta. Jomo Kenyatta was a Kenyan anti-colonial activist and politician who governed Kenya as its prime minister from 1963 to 1964 and then as its first president from 1964 to his death in 1978. Kenyatta was born as Kamau's son of Ngengi at Ishaweri in Kiambu, British East Africa. Kenyatta's father was a leader of a small Kikuyu agricultural settlement. Kenyatta's first contact with the Europeans was when he underwent surgery at a newly established Church of Scotland mission. Kenyatta became a resident pupil at the mission after running away from home. At the mission school, Kenyatta studied the Bible, English, mathematics, and carpentry, and paid his fees by working as a houseboy and cook for a European settler. In August 1914, Kenyatta was baptized with the name Johnston Kamau. Kenyatta left the mission and got a job as a clerk in the Public Works Department, and he also adopted the name Kenyatta, which was the term for a fancy belt that he wore. Kenyatta also briefly served as an interpreter in the High Court before transferring to a post with the Nairobi Town Council. At about this time, Kenyatta married and began to raise a family. The East Africa Association, which was a political protest movement in Kenya against the white settler-dominated government, began in 1921. It was led by Harry Thuku, an educated young Kikuyu. Kenyatta joined the East Africa Association in 1922. One of the major purposes of the East Africa Association was to recover Kikuyu lands lost when Kenya became a British colony in 1920. The Africans were dispossessed, leaseholds of land were restricted to white settlers, and native reservations were established. In 1925, the East Africa Association disbanded as a result of government pressures. Its members reformed as the Kikuyu Central Association. 3 years later, Kenyatta became the Kikuyu Central Association's General Secretary, and he had to give up his municipal job. Jomo Kenyatta began his political life when he launched a monthly Kikuyu language newspaper called Muigithania in May 1928. The aim of this newspaper was to gain support from all sections of the Kikuyu. The paper was mild in tone and was tolerated by the government. A British commission recommended a closer union of the three East African territories, that is Kenya, Uganda, and Tanganyika. British settler leaders supported the proposal, expecting that internal self-government might follow. To the Kikuyu Central Association, such a proposal looked disastrous for Kikuyu interests, and in 1929, Kenyatta traveled to London to lobby for Kikuyu land affairs. As a result of Kenyatta's testimony on the issue of closer union of the three colonies, the government temporarily abandoned its plan for the union. During the 1930s, Kenyatta visited the Soviet Union and spent 2 years at Moscow State University and also traveled extensively through Europe. Kenyatta came back to England and studied anthropology at the London School of Economics. His thesis was revised and published in 1938 as Facing Mount Kenya, which was a study of the traditional life of the Kikuyu. Kenyatta briefly joined the Communist Party. He met other black nationalists and writers and organized protests against the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. The start of the First World War temporarily cut Kenyatta off from the Kikuyu Central Association, which had by now been banned by Kenya authorities. Kenyatta returned to Kenya in September 1946 and took up leadership of the newly formed Kenya African Union, which he was elected president in June 1947. Kenyatta lobbied for independence from British colonial rule. He attracted widespread support from the indigenous people, but animosity from white settlers. On October 21, 1952, Kenyatta was arrested and charged of having directed the Mau Mau movement. Kenyatta was among the Kapenguria 6 who were arrested and charged with masterminding the anti-colonial Mau Mau uprising. In April 1953, Kenyatta was sentenced to a 7-year imprisonment for managing the Mau Mau terrorist organization. Kenyatta denied the charge then and afterward, maintaining that the Kenya African Union's political activities were not directly associated with Mau Mau violence. Kenyatta remained imprisoned at Lokitong until 1959 and was then exiled to Lodwar until 1961. The British government responded to Africans' demands and gradually steered the country toward African majority rule. In 1960, the principle of one man, one vote was conceded. Kenyan nationalist leaders such as Tom Mboya and Oginga Odinga organized the Kenya African National Union and elected Kenyatta, who was still in detention, as president. The nationalist leaders refused to cooperate with the British while Kenyatta was in detention. In a press conference, Kenyatta promised that Europeans would find a place in the future for as long as they took their place as ordinary citizens. Kenyatta was released in August 1961 and at the London Conference in early 1962 negotiated the constitutional terms that led to Kenya's independence. The KANU and KADU representatives met with British officials to formulate a new constitution. KADU desired a federalist state organized on a system called Majimbo, with 6 largely autonomous regional authorities, a 2-chamber legislature, and a central federal council of ministers who would select a rotating chair to serve as head of government for a 1-year term. KANU opposed Majimbo, believing it served entrenched interests and denied equal opportunities across Kenya. They also insisted on an elected head of government. The May 1963 general election pitted Kenyatta's KANU against KADU, the Akamba People's Party, and various independent candidates. KANU won the pre-independence elections and formed a provisional government. Kenya celebrated its independence on December 12, 1963, with Kenyatta as Prime Minister. In December 1964, Kenya was officially proclaimed a republic and Kenyatta became its executive president. Between 1965 and 1966, several constitutional amendments enhanced the president's power. For instance, a May 1966 amendment gave the president the ability to order the detention of individuals without trial if he thought the security of the state was threatened. Kenyatta sought the support of Kenya's second largest ethnic group at that time, the Luo, by appointing Oginga Odinga as his vice president. The Kikuyu held most of the country's important government and administrative positions. This contributed to a perception among many Kenyans that independence had simply seen the dominance of a British elite replaced by the dominance of a Kikuyu elite. After independence, Kenya's economy was heavily molded by colonial rule. Agriculture dominated while industry was limited. Kenya heavily relied on exporting primary goods and importing capital and manufactured goods. Kenyatta's policy was capitalist and entrepreneurial. Kenya's agricultural and industrial sectors were dominated by Europeans and its commerce and trade by Asians. One of Kenyatta's most pressing issues was to bring the economy under indigenous control. There was growing black resentment towards Asian domination of the small business sector. The 1965 session paper promised an Africanization of the Kenyan economy. The government established the Industrial and Commercial Development Corporation to provide loans to black-owned businesses, while the Trade Licensing Act of 1967 prohibited non-citizens from the involvement in the rice, sugar, and maize trade. Many Asians who had retained British citizenship were affected by these measures, and between 1967 and 1968, many Kenyan Asians migrated to Britain before a legal change revoked their right to do so. The question of land ownership had a deep emotional resonance in Kenya. It had been a major grievance against the British colonialists. The British government agreed to provide £27 million to Kenya with which to buy out white farmers and redistribute their land among the indigenous population. Kenyatta's government encouraged the establishment of private land buying companies that were headed by prominent politicians. The government sold or leased lands in the former White Highlands to these companies, which in turn subdivided them among individual shareholders. Kenyans who had made claims on land on the basis of ancestral ownership often found the land given to other people, including Kenyans from different parts of the country. People started to condemn the redistribution, and in 1969, the sale of historically Nandi lands in the Rift Valley to non-Nandis was stopped. Under Kenyatta's government, there was an increase in the rural to urban migration due to high levels of rural unemployment. Kenyatta's government was eager to control the country's trade unions, fearing their ability to disrupt the economy. To achieve this, the government emphasized social welfare schemes over traditional industrial institutions. In 1965, the Kenya Federation of Labour became known as the Central Organization of Trade, a body which was under strong government influence. No strikes could be legally carried out in Kenya without permission. Measures were also put in place to Africanize the civil service, and by the mid-1967, it had become 91% African. During the 1960s and 70s, the public sector grew faster than the private sector, and this contributed to the significant expansion of the indigenous middle class in Kenya. During Kenyatta's presidency, there was a massive expansion in education facilities. Between 1964 and 1966, the number of primary schools grew by 11.6% and secondary schools by 80%. By the time of Kenyatta's death, Kenya's first universities, the University of Nairobi and Kenyatta University, had been established. Although Kenyatta died without having attained the goal of a free universal primary education in Kenya, the country had made significant advances in that direction, with 85% of Kenyan children in primary education, and within a decade of independence had trained enough numbers of Kenyans to take over the civil service. Kenyatta's government also improved access to healthcare services. The improved medical care resulted in declining mortality rates while birth rates remained high. Before independence, the average life expectancy in Kenya was 45, but by the end of the 1970s, it was 55. Like any other presidency, Kenyatta's presidency also had the other side. And under Kenyatta's regime, corruption became widespread throughout the government, civil service, and business community. Kenyatta and his family were tied up with this corruption as they enriched themselves through mass purchases of property after 1963. His family used his presidential position to circumvent legal or administrative obstacles to acquire property. Let us now look at Kenyatta's personality and personal life. Kenyatta was a flamboyant with an extroverted personality. Kenyatta liked to dress elaborately, and he was a polygamist. Records indicate he had 4 spouses: Grace Wahu, whom he married in 1919. Then we had Edna Clark between 1942 and 1946. There was Grace Wanjiku in 1950 and Ngina Kenyatta. Jomo Kenyatta had 8 children and died on the 22nd of August 1978. In Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta is regarded as the founding father of the nation. Kenyatta has been described as one of the greatest men of the 20th century, having been a beacon, a rallying point for suffering Kenyans to fight for their rights, justice, and freedom. This brings us to the end of this video and also to the end of the 5 videos in which we have looked at the political lives of the 5 Kenyan presidents. I hope you have enjoyed the videos. I shall see you in the next one. Bye for now.